So it is a done deal. The Council of the European Union, this is the heads of state of the European Union, have agreed, and away we go.
Yes, formal adoption of projects at a government level. I think that's going to include things like research and development, certainly streamlining procurement procedures and so forth. So PESCO, not to be confused with Tesco, although this is a military supermarket which is being built in Europe, Mike.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, and you've completely, I've forgotten what I was going to say next. So we'll move straight ahead because
it was that good, wasn't it?
It was that good, yes. So the other fantastic piece of news today, of course, is the fact that, well, Benjamin Netanyahu was visiting the head of PESCO herself, Federica Mogherini, the head of the new
president of Europe, pretty much from a public relations standpoint. She's pretty much doing the statesman job, isn't she, for major announcements, interacting with the outside, with the global EU.
She is the de facto foreign minister.
She is
in waiting. She's the deputy president of the European Commission. But yes, she is behaving like a foreign minister.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So she was meeting Benjamin Netanyahu today, who, of course, not really taking the advice of Donald Trump, because when he made when Trump made his initial statement about recognition of Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel, in that sort of announcement to Israel, he sort of said, you know, just downplay this a little bit, please. Just downplay. What does Netanyahu do? He immediately gets on the stage, and the world stage that is, and starts traveling the world, trying to encourage every nation under the sun to support Trump in this idea that Jerusalem is to be the capital of Israel. And I think this kind of highlights the situation of the European Union, if we think about it in terms of PESCO and Defence Union as well, because what is being created here is a single block with multiple. So he doesn't need to go to Germany and France, and he only needs to go to one place now.
And this is the whole significance of what Federica Mogherini is doing in the public sphere is from a public relations point of view. She's got 28 member states behind her when she talks. Every word that comes out of her mouth has 28, theoretically, symbolically, 28 member states behind her. So this is much more, this totally transforms the sort of world stage in terms of diplomacy, in terms of geopolitics. So what you're getting here is a future look at what the United States of Europe will look like in terms of international relations right here. You also saw this with the Iran nuclear deal as well, and you'll see this also with a number of other important issues which are being fleshed out right now. So she's become the go-to person for that sort of money shot with the gold stars on the blue flag behind her. And Bibi Netanyahu is the consummate political animal. He is like a desperate labor union leader running around trying to forge coalitions and grab carpetbag votes and you name it. This is what he's doing. It seems to me like an act of desperation, Mike. The Netanyahu would feel so compelled to go on a whistle-stop tour right after that was supposed to kind of, you know, keep it down for just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
So he's not keeping it down, and as a result, there is protest.
There is. So we're probably going to see something big happen today in Lebanon. We were just on the phone last night with Lebanese journalist Marwa Osman, and there were huge demonstrations yesterday at the American Embassy compound, which is north of Beirut. The Americans actually relocated the embassy outside of the city center there, up in the hills, and it's basically a military fortified type compound. And Palestinian protesters and supporters came and actually managed to tear part of the secure steel gates away as well. I mean, this is the most fortified embassy, one of the most, probably top 5 in the world, and it shows you how, I don't know what the word is, but basically if protesters want to tear down a wall, they'll tear it down. It doesn't matter how big or thick it is. But so expect upwards of, I don't know, 10,000 plus. We're going to be out in the streets today, maybe 20,000 in Beirut.
So in Beirut, in the suburbs, Dahia, is that pronounced?
Yeah, this is Dahia. This is more the Shiite neighborhood. This is a Hezbollah stronghold in terms of politically, anyway. And this is the area of Beirut that the Americans tell any visitors not to visit because it's full of terrorists.
Right.
So it's going to scare them away.
Okay, well, let's move on then, because Netanyahu actually has also been meeting Monsieur Macron, the president of France. Well, apparently we've all got to read the Bible because that's where it says that Jerusalem is the capital.
Unbelievable. So Bibi Netanyahu says, look, Jerusalem is the capital. Read your Bible. You know, and it was so crass, this speech. It was also very patronizing. And you could see the young Macron there, who's still very green behind the ears as a statesman, not knowing quite what to make of it or how to react. But for Netanyahu to make this speech now, he's now invoking the Bible openly and publicly, which is something that they didn't do before. And again, this plays into what I said earlier, Mike. You're looking at a desperate political leader there, and so he's trying to prop up this narrative that somewhere in the Bible God played the role of the estate agent and has gifted this land to this new inhabitants, some of who arrived in 1948, and that's it. End of story. No more argument. It's in the Bible. So this is the argument that Israel's now putting forward openly, which before, Mike, was kind of kept kind of off to the fringes and discussed in certain areas, but they didn't really come out and have that as the major plank of their foreign policy or the domestic policy. But now there it is. So it's all out in the open now. I don't know what comes next, Mike, but I think you're going to see a lot more protests and a lot more, potentially, maybe some more violence in streets and demonstrations around the world.
Okay, well, let's move on to Syria, and well, Mr. Putin has arrived there.
There he is, coming off the plane at the Latakia Khmeimim Air Force Base, and so he's there to announce formally, has ordered his defense minister to withdraw Russian troops back to their permanent positions in the homeland in Russia. So this is amazing in one sense, because this is exactly what Putin said he would do when he arrived last in when they redeployed the Russian forces before.
Yeah.
So what you're looking at here, Mike, is a statesman, and you say, how do you get an 86% approval rating? How does a leader get that? Well, one thing that you can do is if you do everything exactly what you said you're going to do, and you actually do it, and you deliver on everything that you promised, there's a good chance that you will get an 86% approval rating.
I mean, I realize there's lots of politicians probably out there that might listen to what you've said. That question that you've asked, and you said, well, you get an 86% approval rating by fixing the polls.
By fixing the polls.
But this would be the Western political thought, because they cannot conceive of the idea of actually becoming a politician and doing what you say you're going to do.
Right. So we project our cynicism that we have in the West. We're constantly projecting this all over the world and saying, no, you don't want good, competent leadership. You don't want coherent foreign policy. What you want is a fractured, ramshackle, every month we're rotating our cabinet type government that's totally dysfunctional. That's what you want. That's real democracy. So we totally project this cynicism on every other country, especially in the developing world, not knowing that there are people around the world, Mike, that actually want strong, coherent leadership, especially in times of crisis. They do exist, these countries. They may not necessarily exist in Western Europe or the United States, but they're out there. This is a reality, and this is what Russia is kind of demonstrating on the world stage this week.
Well, let's talk about one of the best examples that Britain can provide, which is a really sad indictment, and that is Boris, because, of course, last week we weren't sure where he was because he was busy in Brussels getting involved in NATO-EU relations and EU military unification, so that couldn't be talked about, and he basically disappeared from the Western media. He then went to Iran over the weekend, where he was trying to deal with this situation over Ms. Zaghari Ratcliffe. But today, Patrick, he is in United Arab Emirates on the last leg of his Gulf visit to discuss Yemen, because apparently by going to the United Arab Emirates and discussing with them the situation that's going to solve the problem overnight?
It certainly is, because after all, it is the UAE who have deployed their mercenary army to fight alongside Saudi Arabia and, funny enough, fighting alongside Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which is quite an odd coalition.
Isn't it amazing that everywhere that Boris goes, he seems to always bump into people that have direct links to Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda related organizations?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's just coincidence. It must be coincidence.
Even in Westminster, it happens. So it's amazing. So what is Britain going to get out of this? Well, maybe selling some arms to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, selling some Typhoons. This is probably what he's over there doing. In fact, Mike, that's what David Cameron and Tony Blair both did, is they acted as sales reps for the arms industry. So they're there to close deals, essentially.
Absolutely.
Arms deals. And to hell with the people in Yemen. Who cares about them? We just need to drop as many bombs as we can before the next general election.
Speaking of Yemen, geopolitics alert here. The headline is, with Saleh dead, will the US now consider direct military action in Yemen?
This is a good question. And if you look at the United States had passed a resolution back in November to sort of step up. We'll look at that in a second. Yeah. There it is. And so this House vote went through, but the problem is, Mike, the action that was supposed to back up what looks like a coup to overthrow Ansarullah, or what the Americans call the Houthis, in the capital Sana'a, with the help of UAE forces and other pieces of that puzzle dispatched out of Aden. It didn't happen, Mike. So something went awry here. Perhaps Ansarullah was tipped off about what was going to happen. And so the U.S. it seemed to me that they were slated to deploy a significant amount of military assets into Yemen, probably under the guise of an anti-terror operation. But all that's needed here is to declare the Houthis Iranian-backed and therefore a terrorist group, and that would sort of open the door for an intervention here. That seems to me what Congress is setting up there. So they're putting the ball on the tee, Mike, and right now Trump's deciding which club to pull out of the bag to whack that with, and off they go. Another deployment, another crisis in the Middle East, another distraction as well, to distract from the complete failure of the United States in Syria, but also the fact that the United States have 2,000 plus troops still stationed inside Syria. This is after ISIS has been defeated. So this is going to be a problem going forward.
An occupying army.
An occupying army in a country completely uninvited and totally, I might add, against international law and the rules-based global order that Theresa May often speaks about, Mike.
Well, speaking of Theresa May, at the weekend, she finally offered congratulations to Iraq on the final defeat of ISIS. It took her some time.
Credit where credit's due, and we always do give credit where credit's due. That was probably the first move that she's ever made as prime minister that's truly a statesperson-like. Is that politically correct? Stateswoman-like, statesmen-like, whichever the case is. That's the first true move that May has done to act like a statesperson. So to acknowledge the fact that, yes, Iraq defeated ISIS in Iraq, and it was not the U.S.-led coalition. The U.S.-led coalition provided some air support, but by the way, the Iraqi government's paid for those airstrikes. By the way, Uncle Sam invoiced the Iraqi government for those airstrikes. Very expensive as well.
Right, so Theresa May has said that. That government position doesn't seem to extend to Syria, because in Syria we're still saying that, well, we defeated ISIS in Syria. Britain is saying that it was the US-led coalition that did the job, and the RAF, of course, part and parcel of that. Well, the Russians aren't quite as willing to accept that. And this is Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, who said, our Western partners have been saying in the recent days that it was not Russia, but them, the coalition, that defeated the Islamic State in Syria. The last to say this was French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Le Drian. Dear sirs, stop it. Your successes in Iraq, your successes are Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan. Come on, be proud of them. And I think that pretty much sums up the situation, because we have absolutely destroyed those countries through our actions. And unlike other heads of state, for some reason, the heads of state in our countries, which are responsible for this, haven't been brought to The Hague to discuss potential war crimes.
Yeah, because our heads of state sound like the foreign ministry of Oceania at the moment. They can't seem to get the narrative right. Hence, Maria Zakharova can destroy her opponents with rhetoric because Russia has the high ground in terms of this argument. Therefore, they're able to apply real satire downstream, which is phenomenal. But that kind of shows you can't apply satire like that unless you are, you've got the high ground morally. So clearly, Russia does.
Now, you wanted to highlight this from Stars and Stripes. This is a report saying 44,000 unknown military personnel stationed around the world.
This is extraordinary, Mike. So this is from one of the U.S. Army's main communication portals. 44,000. They cannot and will not stipulate exactly where and what these 44,000 are doing. We talked about 2,000 plus in Syria, Mike, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I would say the U.S. have troops deployed in Yemen right now as well, and probably a number of other countries. And Britain also falls into this category, although the numbers are much, much less. And so this is incredible. So what's this costing? Is this transparent? Is this how the U.S. are running their operations overseas now, off books?
And how much Department for International Development money and USAID money is going to actually support this? Yeah. Is this on the official military budget, or is this being classed as aid? And of course, we know that in Britain's case, we're sending troops to other countries to train the local government military personnel and so on, police as well, we're training. And then, having done that training, we seem to find that these countries tend to have some kind of internal insurgency or some kind of internal strife. 44,000 military personnel stationed around the world, they should just be brought back home, really, and leave people to build their own nations without interference from neo-colonialist agendas.
So the answer to your question, Mike, is it's a bit of both. Some of these things are going through the Department of Defense. Some other things, support activity using privatized suppliers or NGOs. This is sort of off the books. So this is a combination of both. They're complementing each other. This is how neocolonialism is done in the 21st century now. Most of it is off the books.
Now, poor old Mikhail Saakashvili, he is getting quite a bit of coverage on the UK column over the last week or two. Well, he was arrested, then he wasn't, then he was, and now he's on hunger strike.
A sad character, if there ever was one. Truly a tragic character of geopolitics. And
I mean, is this what happens, Patrick, whenever Soros drops you? You fall apart.
You fall apart. You end up on the roof of a prison in a bathrobe, clenching your fist and shaking it to your supporters down below. Or are they his supporters? We don't know. But this poor guy, I mean, this is what happens when you go to work as a globalist stooge for Washington, for George Soros. This is where you end up. So pay attention, anybody out there who is planning on getting George or Uncle Sam to provide your magic carpet for your geopolitical ambitions. This is where you're going to end up, exactly where Saakashvili has ended up.
Yes. Now you've been quite surprised that he's been arrested in Ukraine. I mean, because your point, I think, is that it's a pretty hard thing to do to get yourself arrested in Ukraine. They tend to put up with quite a lot of corruption.
Well, yeah, it's practically a criminal mafia state. Was put in power really by a beer hall putsch in 2014. I mean, how can you fall afoul? Someone as crooked as Saakashvili, he would be perfectly at home in that sort of environment, and they would want guys like this, I would imagine. But apparently, maybe they're trying to tighten up their act in the Ukraine, and there's not many places left, Mike, you see. If the doors are shut globally, where do you go? If you couldn't make it in the Ukraine, there's only one place left. You have to go to Albania, which is now being run by Tony and Sherry Blair. So this is the last stop for a globalist stooge is Albania, with a job with Tony Blair and Associates. And you think I'm joking? Go ahead and look it up. Tony Blair is now, and his wife are half in charge, it seems, of the government in Albania.
Well, he's in charge of the government. She's in charge of the the judiciary.
Of the courts, yeah.
So it's a pretty bad combination for that country.
There could be a job opening for a lawyer who's going on hunger strike right now.
Yeah.
In Kiev. We'll see.
But Ukraine, of course, well, the revolution hasn't done them much good. Patrick, at the end of the day, Ukraine is Europe's poorest nation with a $220 average monthly wage. For a European country, that's a pretty bad situation.
It's appalling. So it's 190 euros a month is the figure that you'd be looking at there. I mean, they think it's bad in Portugal with the 700 euro a month wage. It's a basket case. The Ukraine is an economic basket case that's just a teetering on the edge of being an IMF, another IMF plantation for usury loans internationally. So. But it's also been totally colonized, Mike, by a couple of U.S. corporations have managed to take over. I'm talking about companies like Cargill, Monsanto, and these firms have moved in, taken over the agricultural sector, at least a good portion of it in the Ukraine, which is considered the breadbasket, one of the major breadbaskets of the world. Who knows what it's going to be? It could be the world's #1 GMO producing country probably in a few years. We don't know. But that's exactly what happened after the US-backed coup in 2014. Oops, did I call it a coup? Was I not supposed to call it a coup?
I couldn't comment on that.
What was a putsch then?
A putsch?
A putsch.
We're going to start off with, with Devon and Cornwall Police, because apparently the best thing to do is to patrol key locations, they're saying, and events over the festive period and the new year with the support from armed officers. So officers will be visibly carrying long armed weapons, i.e. machine guns, to help offer further security and reassurance during this busy time of the year, as well as having support from our dog unit. So this is the head of Alliance Operations, Chief Superintendent Jim Nye, said, "I want to reassure the public there's no increase in the threat level, nor is this in reaction to any specific threat within Devon, Cornwall and Dorset." Because, Alex, these are the hubs of terrorist activity in the United Kingdom, and we need to have armed police on the streets at this festive season to make sure that everybody has the maximum festive spirit possible.
Well, it's a bit odd, Mike, I have to say. I mean, allegedly, this massive terrorist threat comes from certain Muslim and Asian communities, which are notably thin on the ground in the West Country. For our foreign viewers, we're talking about this Southwest Peninsula, deep into it as well, the bottom of that Southwest Peninsula of Britain, which is known for being very white and largely middle class and rural. So I really don't see what the threat is. Someone in the chat box is suggesting that Santa is now an SAS soldier. That's not really far wide of the mark, I'm afraid, these days. You know, we're having people saying that a lot of children will never be able to get to see a Santa in a grotto without him being flanked by policemen with rifles and carbines.
It's a sad indictment of modern British society, I think. A series of declassified documents have been published by the National Security Archive. This is George Washington University, and these were published yesterday. It's called NATO Expansion: What Gorbachev Heard. Now, according to these documents, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker's famous "not 1 inch eastward" assurance about NATO expansion in his meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990, in February 1990, was part of a cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev and other Soviet officials throughout the process of German unification in 1990 and 1991. And it goes on to say that the first concrete assurances by Western leaders on NATO began on January 31st, 1990, when West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher opened the bidding with a major public speech in Tutzing in Bavaria on German unification. And it goes on to say that the US Embassy in Bonn informed Washington by cable that Genscher made clear that changes in Eastern Europe and the German unification process must not lead to an impairment of Soviet security interests. Therefore, NATO should rule out an expansion of its territory towards the east, i.e. moving it closer to the Soviet borders. And that cable also noted that Genscher's proposal to leave East German territory out of NATO's out of NATO military structures, even in a unified Germany in NATO. And this became known as the Tutzing formula. And it immediately became the center of a flurry of important diplomatic discussions over the next 10 days in 1990, leading to the crucial February the 10th, 1990 meeting in Moscow between Chancellor Kohl and Gorbachev, when the West German leader achieved Soviet assent in principle to German unification in NATO, as long as NATO did not expand to the east. Well, they only waited a couple of decades, and away they continued with their plans. Alex, it's interesting that this has been released at this time, and it's an interesting little piece of history. And anybody, what can you say about it? NATO has expanded to the east, and the Soviet Union may have disappeared, but the Russians cannot feel any less upset about it nonetheless.
Russo-German or Soviet-German relations are the absolute linchpin of all 20th century geopolitics, and from the late 19th onwards. And all the flim-flam about Anglo-French relations, Anglo-American tussles, is all second fiddle to that. And geopolitics is so arranged that we are not given in English the stuff that's written in German and Russian about these relationships. They're very personal. For example, Mrs. Kohl committed suicide, not well known. And Mr. Kohl's just died recently, but he was a widower for many years because his wife committed suicide because of the delayed trauma of having been raped by Red Army soldiers in 45, I think it was, in eastern Germany. And she could never bear to hear Gorbachev speak on the phone to her husband because she couldn't bear the sound of Russian anymore. This predisposed Kohl to be a kind of suppliant to the Soviets, but he had to butter up Thatcher and Reagan to get unification through. What's been released there is new, but the likes of Dr. Eric Zeus, whom we had on our special Insight episode on Eurasia, Zeus and others have intimated this knowledge of this in advance because, as Zeus pointed out, Gorbachev was told by Baker, acting on behalf of George H.W. Bush, that we will never move an inch eastwards, but he could not get it on paper. And as Zeus says, the Soviets' mistake in the dying days of the USSR was to assume they were dealing with gentlemen, whereas in fact they were dealing with, he doesn't use the word, but these are in fact Luciferians who wish to destroy Russia as the last bastion of what you want to call European Christendom or patriotism, and to take over so that there would be a single world banking system and effectively an end to nations. Because people weren't aware in those days of just how evil George H.W. Bush was. I don't think Baker was quite that evil. People didn't really assume that. But this is all coming out now, as you say. One
other thing that did grab my attention in this was, and I'll quote again here, it says, the French leader, François Mitterrand, was not in a mind meld with the Americans, quite the contrary, as evidenced by his telling Gorbachev in Moscow on May the 25th, 1990, that he was, quotes, personally in favor of gradually dismantling the military blocs. But he continued the cascade of assurances, this says, by saying, the West must create security conditions for you as well as European security as a whole. So we get a hint that EU military unification or European military unification was on their minds even back in 1990.
Yes, indeed, and we are going to move our timeline backwards to cover more of the 1940s, 50s and 60s, the European Union military unification timeline, which is on the front page of UK column, but it has been in play all these times. It was the French that resisted it in the mid-50s because they were still thinking that they could lead some other format and preserve nominal national sovereignty and prestige. The British and the Americans were pushing towards this for decades and telling their client state, the Germans, what to do. And for a long time, it was the Soviet Union that was seeing the writing on the wall and holding this back. So that's why another one of the reasons why 1990 was such a crucial, pivotal moment in geopolitics. I mean, I visited just after 1990, in fact, the border area, Thüringen, and I was given a piece of the barbed wire from the frontier. But the interesting thing was it had been snapped up immediately. And as soon as you crossed the border in 91, 92, they had made every effort, particularly on the eastern side, to dismantle all these, everything but the pillboxes, basically, that couldn't be uprooted, dismantle the barbed wire and the installations. You couldn't see when you were passing the former border. But having gone back more recently, I was struck by the fact that the older people were reminiscent of, at least in the old days, we had protection from the Soviets. They're kind of obsessed with military and security, particularly in Eastern Germany, and you can understand why. But it's been latent in the population all this time. They have a sense that they don't want to be the front line anymore. They want to push that front line eastwards. So, in a sense, even the population and the trauma that the people have gone through has kind of had a knock-on effect into politics and has given the Germans a sense of we must push eastwards. I noticed that Angela Merkel made this point to President Trump recently and said the Germans don't want to pay any more for the military. They wouldn't be happy with it. And for once, I think I would agree with Trump's response. He said, Angela, baby, you have to understand that the Americans are not happy footing the bill as it is. There is a financial aspect to all this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's come back to the UK then. Excuse me. And the government has published a new job. You can apply for it if you wish. It's for wargame designer and analyst. The closing date for applications is the 14th of January 2018. The pay grade is between 24,000 and 35,000, and you're going to be based at the DSTL. The job description asks, do you love designing or participating in war games? Do you have experience in developing unconventional ideas which inspire people to think differently? Do you want to work in a dynamic, fast-paced environment which will challenge you to adapt to intellectual challenges throughout your working day? And they say you will assist in the design and development of war games, translating customer requirements into practicable designs based on credible overarching scenarios and vignettes. Find ways to improve and exploit existing wargame systems, evaluating them for suitability and applicability in order to explore, test, inform the customer's key requirements and so on. And they're looking for someone who can find ways to improve and adapt elements of existing commercial hobby game rule sets to meet requirements and deliver creative and engaging war games or design and innovate game mechanics from scratch. Alex, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, war games have a long history in the British and American Ministries of Defence, and in this case, it's an appendage of the MOD called DSTL, significantly at their Fareham site, which is near Portsmouth, supposedly our main naval dockyard. There has been a long history of it, but wargaming is a very good cover for actual war plans. Because you can say it's just a scenario, isn't it? For example, War Plan Red in the 1930s, when just as on the eve of the First World War, in fact, the American elite was thinking, can we topple the British Empire? And in both cases, they held back and thought, actually, no, the Germans are doing that just fine for us. And the same is going on now, but with the Russians in play, I think. And at the back of this is someone's planning for Europe to be knocked out, for which see our Joel Skousen interview, Europe to be knocked out and have its economy taken over by a Eurasian blob, which may in fact be more deserving than what's left of the Anglo-Zionist blob. But it's a well thought out way of planning advanced scenarios in which continental players in the good old British tradition are got to nudge and to start something off. And of course, the knack in this is to try to get away with it, because if you can have it pinned on you that you started a Third World War, Russia will be utterly ruthless because its survival is at stake. And I'm afraid all this ends up with something a lot more serious than games. It ends up with nuclear bombs. And we can only hope that if it gets that far, it will be on remote military targets. There's some suggestion, in fact, that the London establishment already suspects, or some of the elite players in it who are in the cabals, they know that that's the likely outcome if they keep prodding, and that may be why they've moved all the naval and nuclear things up to Faslan, because who cares about Scotland getting nuked?
Yes, well, I mean, but the question in my mind was, when you would have expected a wargaming scenario, somebody that's working in this area, for it to be quite a serious thing, and I was particularly struck by this. We are looking for someone who can help find ways to improve and adapt elements of existing commercial hobby game rule sets to meet requirements. I mean, is this something that is common for the defence planning to be based on hobby game rules?
No, there has been a recent tradition for GCHQ to take some of its code crackers from the gaming and hacking world. And NSA's done that for longer. It's kind of taking the black hat off a hacker and putting him on the good team, as it were. But the military, and particularly wargaming, always used to be done by, mustachioed colonels and air commodores and the like, with quite some reserve behind them. But the profile and the salary for this job, and the mention of talking to commercial gaming, suggests they want someone in their mid-20s, if not younger. And that is really very dangerous, because then the person is putty in your hands and has usually quite a naive view of the world, and will swallow the idea that the Russians are evil and out to get us. So effectively, you'll be a toy in the hands of some think tank or cabal.
Indeed, I think that was my concern as well. So thanks for that, Alex. Welcome, Vanessa. You're in Lebanon at the moment.
Yeah, I am. Apologies. Internet connection. It seems to be losing it a little bit, but I think it's okay.
I think we'll be fine. We'll be fine. Now, we want to start straight away with the protests that were going on. Sorry, the protests that were going on in Lebanon on Monday when you arrived. This is your footage, which is on 21st Century Wire at the moment. Just remind us of the background to this, what caused this demonstration, and really what's happened since Monday in Lebanon.
Well, I mean, this was as a result of the President Trump's unilateral decision to declare or to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which, of course, has unleashed fairly strident reactions globally, actually. But this rally in Daya, in the suburb of Beirut, was organized, obviously, by the director of Hezbollah in protest against this move by President Trump. And it was quite an extraordinary rally. I mean, it was certainly one of the most powerful and challenging speeches that I've heard from Nasrallah. I mean, it really set down the ground rules. It basically stated the fact that now terrorism, which is international terrorism, has been defeated pretty much in the region, so in Syria and in Iraq predominantly. Now the priority must once again be Al-Quds and be Palestine. And so this was a call to arms almost for the believers in the resistance, for the believers in the freedom of Palestine. And as I said, it was one of the most powerful and challenging and defiant speeches that I've been privileged to be a part of.
Vanessa, just an observation here. As I was watching this earlier, it looks to me like the majority of the crowd is women and children.
Yes, but largely. I mean, you'll see some of the fighters around the edges of the crowd, but the majority are, as you say, women, children. But also what was extraordinary was to see the Palestinian flags alongside the Hezbollah, alongside the Lebanese flag. So this was total unity of all factions. And this is what we're seeing all the time. These attempts at enforcing Israeli dominance and supremacy in the region, both by Saudi Arabia, by the United States, by the UK, by Israel itself, are failing, because what they're working on is generating sectarian divisions, and particularly in Lebanon recently with the faux resignation of Hariri in Saudi Arabia, etc. This was hoped it would create divisions between the sects within Lebanon, but in fact what it's done is unified them, as we see now. With the Al-Quds issue being put back center stage by Trump's decision, what we're actually seeing is a tremendous unification behind Palestine, behind Al-Quds, and against Israeli supremacy. So in fact, their entire project is failing. It's floundering at the moment. And it's floundering because what they've worked on for decades is this sectarianism ploy project. And in fact, now what's happened is there's been a counter reaction of unification of all those sects. So it's failing dismally. And what we're actually seeing is a risk, I believe, of extinction for not only the illegal state of Israel, but also of Saudi Arabia, because they're putting themselves further and further out onto this brink of isolationism and extremism and supremacism in a region that is now reinforced. It's reinforced by the new global power shift. It's reinforced by the defeat of terrorism, and it's reinforced by a new unification that is happening across the region.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Now, just the protest itself, if anybody wants to have a look at some of the fantastic photographs that Vanessa has taken while she was at that protest on Monday, head over to 21st Century Wire. The headline on this article is "Why Palestine and Al-Quds Are #1 Priority for the Resistance." Now, we're talking about Al-Quds, so let's talk about the statement yesterday. Extraordinary Islamic Summit. This is from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Extraordinary Islamic Summit on Al-Quds calls for internationalizing struggle for peace and imposing political and economic restrictions in response to the US decision. So this is the leaders of 57 Muslim nations calling on the world to recognize the state of Palestine at East Jerusalem as its occupied capital. They're saying that Donald Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital is null and void. They're saying that it is saying that basically Washington has no further role in the Middle East peace process. But the question in my mind, we're talking about the unification of the Muslim world in the Middle East, it seems to a large degree anyway. But Vanessa, where does this leave the situation with Iran? Does this give Iran more influence in the Middle East? And could this be used actually as an excuse by the United States for increased pressure on Iran if they perceive Iran, or if they can argue that Iran is gaining ground in the Middle East with greater influence over many other countries?
Well, the problem is, I think that they'll always be looking to make that claim regardless of whether Iran is gaining influence or not. But you know, I think I was actually discussing with Shamin Nawani this morning, and we need to turn this on its head. Iran is gaining influence in a region which it is intrinsically connected to, in the same way that the UK has a partnership with the US or with the EU. Why should we be surprised by this, and why should we be against this? It is up to this region, it is up to Yemen, it is up to Syria, it is up to Iraq, it is up to Lebanon to decide who both their trade, their economic, and their military partners are, or their defense partners are. They have that right, just as we have that right. You know, Washington has been supplying arms to their chosen client states in the region, which are Saudi Arabia and Israel, for decades, which has led to the destabilization of that region. So I don't think we should even be questioning whether it's a negative that Iran has greater influence in that area. It is up to those countries. It is up to that region to decide whether Iran should have greater influence in that region.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I can't remember exactly when this was, a couple of days ago. Andrew Mitchell, former Secretary of State for International Development, was appearing on Going Underground with Afshin Rattanzi. We've got a couple of clips here, and we'll look at the first one, and then we'll have a comment on it.
Okay, does British policy on Yemen make Britain safer?
Well, I think you have to disaggregate the 2 points you made earlier. One is about the arms sales, so we can deal with that. And the other is about the humanitarian crisis that has developed in Yemen.
So we're giving the aid while exporting lethal weaponry to kill the very same people that we're trying to save?
I think you have to disaggregate the 2 points. And let me explain what I mean by that. Saudi Arabia is surrounded by enemies and is extremely rich. They will always buy weaponry. They'll always get the weaponry. And the weaponry that Britain sells them...
If we don't, somebody else will.
Well, shall I make the point? And therefore, it seems to me that the selling of the weaponry is a second-order issue. If it is legally sent from Britain under an export licensing regime that is the toughest in the world, and it clears those hurdles, then you can take a decision of whether it's right or wrong to supply weapons. But that is a second-order issue because they will get those weapons anyway. The first-order issue is how you stop the attacks on Yemeni civilians, how you address the humanitarian situation.
Before we go on to this second point, you just said someone else will sell it to them. I'm not sure in a court of law, actually, that will pass muster. One NGO, Human Rights in Yemen, is already writing to the Attorney General, Jeremy Wright, saying, no, this is in contravention of any kind of international law.
Well,
Vanessa, this is the argument drug dealers make. If I wasn't providing the drugs, somebody else would. This is incredible. And as Afshin said at the beginning, this is us supplying arms to Saudi Arabia, who are then bombing Yemen. And then we're arguing that we should be putting in humanitarian aid to solve that problem. It's a problem that we created in the first place.
Well, it's also extraordinary that he uses this term disaggregate twice in this discussion, because you cannot disaggregate the fact that Britain is one of the 3 permanent member states on the UN Security Council that is imposing a fully illegitimate resolution 2216, which is an embargo against 5 named individuals, but is being exploited by the Saudi coalition and its allies in the UK and the US and in France to impose this humanitarian blockade upon the Yemeni people. So from both ends, Britain is putting that pressure on. And so you should aggregate them, because basically what they're doing, what Britain is doing and the US is doing, is maintaining this continuum of misery for the Yemeni people. On one end, what they're doing is allowing the blockade, the humanitarian blockade, and on the other, they're supplying the bombs. And they're not only supplying the bombs, they are in the control and command center in Riyadh, much as they will deny that. And they are actively involved in determining the targets. I mean, they're not going to stand in the command and control center and not have anything to say. They will be determining those civilian targets. We also know now that there is British presence in Aden. We know that they are involving themselves on a much deeper level than previously. So, I mean, this was a complete, even the way that he almost described Saudi Arabia in the way that Israel is often described as being the victim and needing to defend itself against all its enemies in the region. I mean, this is an extraordinary argument that was used here. If we don't supply the weapons, somebody else will. But they didn't. Out of that sentence came no desire to end the supply of weapons to this client state that is financing and arming terrorism globally. So we're not only talking about Yemen here. We're also talking about what is happening in the region in Syria, in Iraq, etc. I mean, it's just for a senior politician to come out with a statement like this is diabolical.
Absolutely. Well, it got better, of course.
What do you make of seeing the fact that President Assad's position in Damascus, assured, it seems to be, and all these years, and all these millions, hundreds of millions of pounds worth of British money, where did it all go?
The British taxpayers' money has been absolutely vital in keeping alive and sustaining one of the world's other worst humanitarian crises to the European Union added together.
That may be the case,
spending of British money is absolutely vital.
Better to be preventative.
Grounds.
Okay, but better to be preventative. I mean, we have a report here. We have a leaked memo from the Conflict Stability Security Fund talking about 200 million going to all manner of different activities, which don't seem anything to do with trying to create peace. They seem to be supporting Islamists in Syria.
Well, I think that
will they be returning home to do harm here in Britain?
That is a highly doubtful statistic. Britain has been working.
I have the leaked memo here. 18 million in peace, but 32 million being given to moderate armed groups, 54 million to the White Helmets, which has now been linked to ISIS, Daesh, and Al-Qaeda linked groups.
The White Helmets very nearly won a Nobel Peace Prize.
And
the White House. I know that the Russians,
did Henry Kissinger.
I know the Russians think that the White Helmets are an Islamist front, but actually the clear evidence that we had in Britain was that the White Helmets were incredibly brave men and women in Syria going to the rescue of people under attack from Russian and regime bombs.
Vanessa, are you Russian?
No, I'm not Russian. But I mean, wasn't this extraordinary? I mean, if you watch body language here, the minute that the White Helmets is mentioned, you can almost see the script ping into his head, right? Because we go immediately into these brave men and women. You know, they nearly won a Nobel Peace Prize, and Afshin very quickly puts in, so did Kissinger, and for that matter, so did Obama. And then we go into this entire script. I mean, I should honestly get together all of these people talking about the White Helmets, and I can show that they have literally been given a script from which they're reading every time they have an interview on the White Helmets. They never deviate from these certain facts, men and women pulling people out from under the rubble, 100,000 people saved. Well, who is documenting and archiving and recording these supposed victims that have been saved by the white helmets? But the sheer hypocrisy to sit there and say that British taxpayers' money is being used to ease the humanitarian crisis. It's not. It is going. I mean, the BBC Panorama programme, which only literally tickled the surface of what Britain is actually funding among the terrorist entities that are operating inside Syria. But nevertheless, it did touch on that surface. And Afshin read out figures which have been detailed of what exactly the Conflict Stability and Security Fund is going to, which entities it's going to within Syria. And all of those entities can be proven to be connected to terrorist organizations, led by terrorist organizations, populated by terrorist organizations inside Syria. So, I mean, this is just an extraordinary obfuscation by a Tory politician over the fact that the Tory government has been funding the war in Syria, which is a failed war, with probably well over 200 million of taxpayers' money,
but
while
not just
imposing austerity in the UK.
Yeah, and not just any ordinary Tory politician either, an ex-Secretary of State for International Development, so he knows exactly what's been going on.
Yeah, and in fact, I think he was recently quoted saying that DFID, the Department for International Development, was made in his image. In other words, his influence upon it is still seen today. So even though I think he created it back in, I could be wrong here, 2010, 2011, he basically made a statement in 2016 saying that what he created is still very much as he created it. So he was, and remember that the paperwork that we found in East Aleppo linking Adam Smith and Integrity Consulting to the terrorist organizations was from 2014. So at that point, it was through DFID. It wasn't through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. So, the evidence is becoming unavoidable, and yet they're still avoiding it, and they're still avoiding addressing it.
Absolutely. Now, of course, the big feature of this European Council meeting is PESCO. We had the notification document signed by the 23 earlier in the month. Then we had Ireland and Portugal joining on the 7th of December. And then on the 11th, we had the formal ratification of the notification. So they have all formally agreed to do that. There's been another signing ceremony. And here we go. Today, PESCO is actually being launched. So let's look at the British government reaction to that, because of course we are not joining at this point in time. And Alex, this is another letter, this time written by Earl Howe, who's he's deputy to Mr. Gavin Williamson. So he is a defence minister, and he's saying pretty explicitly that our future relationship with the EU will be that of a third party.
Yes, and in the context of the paragraph, one would read that reassurance to the MP to give back to the constituent as if a way of saying, don't worry, we'll be totally outside it. But of course it isn't, because both EU and British government documents, particularly from the Department for Exiting the European Union, their September position paper, which is quoted by David Ellis in his recent submission at the top of ukcolumn.org/defence, these make it clear that third party is a formal European Union and particularly defence planning, defence industry planning term. And third party means a country which, like Norway in most EU purposes, is part of the club but doesn't help to set the rules, but does pay some of the dues. So it's basically a colonial status, as David Scott put it not too strongly last week. So it's actually an acknowledgement. Earl is lying through his hat here. He knows jolly well what he's saying is Britain will be locked in and will have less say than a member of the European Union.
And in fact, the European Union has no choice, because as the Henry Jackson Society, you have headlined this, even neocons admit Britain has overpaid. But the point here is that Britain is making up some of the shortfalls of other European countries in terms of defence budget.
Yes, and the main reason for that, as even the Henry Jackson Society say with its, as you see the subtitle there, is their Global Britain programme. So these are the people from the banking world driving the idea that Britain should stay in the world and have its soft power thrown around within blocs like the EU and the Commonwealth. These people are having to admit Britain is one of the 4 countries that has a 1/6 share, a 16% share of the bill for the European Investment Bank, which funds all these alphabet soup of defence initiatives. But unlike the 3 other top whack payers, which is France, Germany and Italy, we continue to pay our 2% commitment to NATO and pretend to be a first-rank power. Well, France does too, but it's paid slightly less. So the Germans are the biggest deficit in all this. They are, on paper, they pay it the same as the other big boys, as it were. But there's nearly 100 billion euros, if I'm correct in understanding it, shortfall in what they are paying as against what they should be paying, as particularly in the NATO terms. And Donald Trump made a point of saying this, even in a speech at Pensacola, Florida on the 7th of December, saying to the public that he told Mrs. Merkel this would never go on again. So actually we're paying more. And this is why David Ellis's submission was quite right in saying in some ways we will be the prime contributor to this European military union after we supposedly leave the EU.
One British newspaper did pick this up, and that was the Express. And it said UK props up EU's defence with 17 billion as Germany, Italy and France fail to meet NATO targets. And it goes on to discuss this Henry Jackson Society article. But having done that, they then published this article on today's European Council summit. And their headline is EU Summit, Ireland and France set to dictate future of Britain. And Alex, have a wild stab in the dark at how many times the word defence is used in this article.
That wouldn't be a big fat zero by any chance, would it,
would
Mike?
Indeed, yes, that would be exactly correct. So, you know, I have asked this before, I'm going to ask again. Is there a D notice? Is there some kind of restriction on the mainstream press in Britain covering the issue of European defence? Because they are not covering it at all in terms of, you know, the Express does cover some aspects of it, but in terms of what the events that are happening on a day-to-day basis, they're not covering it in any of their. If there's a European meeting where PESCO or some other aspect of European defence is being discussed, it is never mentioned in any of the articles about those European summits or European meetings, and the same goes for UK government press releases. Alex, I find this is, I mean, what is it? They are lying by omission here. It's fake news, is it not?
Yes, fake news and mendacious. And there's only 3 reasons why you see a universal failure by the press to cover something. There's either command, complicity, or just consensus. So command would be the D notice. Complicity is that they've actually conspired not to do it. And these 2 are possible, quite possible. And I would perhaps slightly prefer find more likely the idea that there's simply a consensus that they all eat from this pot. And so like continental journalists do formally, so British journalists have done informally. They've said, well, we're all part of this caste which benefits from the EU, which is how the EU was set up in the first place, to have rent-seeking people, all the middle classes working for it. And so let's form a compact not to talk about this, because in one sense, if they do, it's more than their job's worth, and in another sense, they know that they're out of their depth. It's rather like the fact that the BBC will never ever, even in its so-called debunking unit, it will never mention UK column. And I've got some confidence in saying, even if we screamed a lot louder and grew our audience share, they still would never mention us. They couldn't afford to, because people would start looking at what we have to say.
Yeah.